The Whys of Business Revisited, Ronald Duska. Duska's article is addressing what might appear to be a very simple or a problem or a question with a very simple answer. And the question is, what's the purpose of business? Now, I think for most of us, we have already an idea of what we at least think the purpose of business is. It's no sort of mystery that for the most part, people view business as a way of maximizing profit. So for most business people, if you ask, why are you going into business? The most common answer is, well, to make money, right? And this is the motivation for investment in various businesses. So when we look at why people invest in various companies, the motivation for investment is to maximize profit. And so we normally say, well, the purpose of business is simply to make profit. But there's a problem with this view, and that's namely that we don't allow all businesses that generate profit. So if we look at what we do when businesses are formed or how society treats businesses, for something to become a business, sort of a separate entity, it's got to incorporate. And so incorporation is sort of a social recognition of a company is now a sort of separate entity. So the question is, do we let any business that anyone wants to have, do we let any business incorporate? So for instance, we don't have businesses that deal in child pornography. Well, if child pornography is profitable and the purpose of business is to generate profit, why wouldn't we allow that? Well, if we wouldn't allow that business, it must be because we look at that as somehow morally problematic. And hopefully you would look at that as morally problematic. And similarly, we might say, well, why don't we offer a business or a market in something like organ donation? Some people have actually proposed this. You say, well, there's problems with people selling their organs. Maybe it's something we don't think we ought to have businesses that buy and sell or trade organs. And so these things we say are not good sorts of enterprises, business enterprises. But if maximizing profit is in fact the purpose of business, and we find things that we might find distasteful or morally questionable, why don't we allow those things to incorporate? Well, for Duska, he believes that it's because we sort of switched around the ideas of motivation and purpose. So for Duska, he says, I've got a different view of what the purpose of business is. And the purpose of business for Ronald Duska is to provide goods and services. So this is not a commonly held view. In fact, this is more, in some ways, a throwback to the original intent of corporations. But for Duska, he says this view is not exactly what we would say a popular view, in part because investors seem to care about returns and not products. So if we look at why people invest in various businesses, they're normally not doing it because they believe that, oh, this is a good product, or I like this service that this company provides. They might say, I like the service it provides because it's a profitable service. And for the most part, when people look at businesses, they say, well, being socially responsible is a good business. But again, you'll notice that when you say being socially responsible is a good business, it's not that being socially responsible is good in itself. It seems to be that being socially responsible is good because it leads to greater profit. And what Duska wants to say is that there's something fundamentally wrong here, that we want to look at exactly what the difference is between purpose of a business and what might motivate someone to go into that business. So Duska's claim here is that we really need to understand what the fundamental purpose of business is and give an argument for that purpose. And once we understand the purpose of anything, then we can better understand how we should morally look at that thing. So as I go back, when we talk about something like a business in child pornography, there's something wrong with that. It can't be that the business is only justified based upon its profitability. There must be something else. It must be tied to what we think businesses are supposed to do in some sense, what their purpose is. And so this is what Duska is looking at in his article, trying to come up with what is the purpose of business versus what's the motivation to do business. Now, the importance of purpose, in order for us to determine that something's acting appropriately, we have to look at what the purpose of that thing is. So Duska wants to use this analysis, and you could use this analysis for anything, right? You could look at what the purpose of an object is. So if we look at something, if we sort of go back to our virtue ethics approach, right? Something functions well if it's functioning in a way that it was designed for, that the purpose of the thing was made. So a good bat is one that's going to be good at hitting baseballs, right? It's going to have a certain form, a certain weight, a certain balance. And so we want to look at the object and say, well, what's the purpose of this thing? And by understanding what its purpose is, we know that a baseball bat is much better at hitting baseballs than it is, say, hammering nails. So once we can define the purpose of the thing, we can also then define the responsibilities of the thing. Now, it's weird to talk, of course, about baseball bats having responsibilities, but in this case, we're going to extend this sort of analysis. What's the purpose of the thing? What's the proper functioning of that thing, given its purpose? And then that will tell us something about its responsibility. We also, by looking at the purpose, we can determine the criteria of evaluation. So just like a baseball bat, if I look at a baseball bat, the criteria of a good bat versus a bad bat will be the exact sort of design specifications, right? Does it have, as I mentioned already, does it have a certain weight or a certain width or a certain balance? And I can then look and say, well, good bats meet these criteria. Bad bats meet these criteria. And we can do this for any sort of object which has a defined purpose. We do this with cars. So we look at a car and we say, well, can it take an impact or rear impact at a certain speed, a head-on at a certain speed? Does it have airbags? Does it get a certain miles per gallon? All of these are various criteria where we might judge then how good that car is, given the purpose of the car is to provide transportation or to provide safe transportation from point A to point B. So Duska needs to do the same thing, or wants to do the same thing with business. If we can sort of spell out the purpose, then we can sort of see what the responsibilities are based on that purpose. And then it will also give us some sort of criteria for determining what are good businesses and what are bad businesses. And in some cases, we may just say we don't want bad businesses to exist at all. So those things that we find perhaps morally objectionable in some way, that don't meet the sort of criteria that we've set out. Now, here's the fundamental distinction that Duska makes, is this the purpose versus the motive. And he says that in business, we've really skewed these things. So the purpose is the what for. What is this thing for? The motive is the psychological forces that move us to act. All right. So when we talk about the purpose of something, we're asking the question, well, what is this thing for? What does it do? What was it designed for? Motive tells us why we might act in a certain way. So let's take two examples. We have marriage. Now, the purpose of marriage might be a number of things. For example, it might be to recognize joint responsibility for children. It might be for tax purposes. So we want people to join together in marriage because socially we think it's a good thing for children to have two parents, say. We also might say it's good for the environment, right? If two people use one residence instead of using the resources of two, we can go in a number of ways. You could have religious reasons why it's good, social reasons why it's good. But that's the purpose. What's the purpose of marriage might be this. The motive, though, for marriage is probably something very different. So normally we don't look at the motive for marriage as saying, well, the motive for marriage is I want a good tax break, or I'm trying to get on so-and-so's insurance policy. The motive is usually something like because I love this person, or I care about this person. I want to spend the rest of my life with this person. That's the motive. But notice there's a difference between the purpose of the ritual, say marriage, and the motive that leads us to actually want to enter into a marriage arrangement. The same thing with education. And this is one that I think oftentimes students, not to mention administrators at times, sort of forget about what the difference is between the purpose of an education and the motive for pursuing an education. So for those of you in business classes, you might say take an accounting class. Well, what's the purpose of an accounting class? The purpose of your accounting class is to teach you accounting principles. Right? It's to teach you how to be an accountant. It's not to get you a job. Now, it might be that you're motivated to take an accounting class because it turns out that that's an easier way to get a job in accounting, that more people are more likely to hire you. But the reason you take accounting is probably very different than the purpose of accounting, right? Accounting is to teach you a particular skill. or a particular set of rules, a way of doing things, whereas the motivation could be completely different. And that goes for any discipline, right? Why do you go to a university versus a community college? Well, there's a different purpose. The purpose of going to university is different than going to a community college or a trade school, right? The purpose of going to trade school might be to learn a trade. What motivates you to learn a trade might be, I would like to make money, or I don't want to go to a university and study 4 years. I want to focus only on those things that I'm going to use to make money. But notice there's two fundamentally different things here. So if someone says, well, you're supposed to get me a job as an educator, I might say, no, that's not my purpose. My purpose is to teach you, for example, ethics. But what motivates you to take ethics might be something else. And I suspect that many of you were probably motivated to take a class in business ethics because you knew, well, I need this for my degree. I need this to graduate. So I'm motivated to take this, not necessarily because I was interested in ethics, but because I was motivated to finish school so that I could go get a job or something like that. So there is a fundamental difference between purpose and motive. And what Duska is saying with regard to business is that we've lost that sort of distinction, right? We've said that, oh, the motive has become the purpose. And he thinks that's a mistake. He thinks that's fundamentally mistaken. So he says, to quote Duska, to confuse the purpose with the motive would be like confusing the purpose of a train to get people from place to place with what drives the train, the engine. The engine is analogous to the motive since it moves the train. So in this case, we have just another example. The purpose and the motive, the purpose of a train is to move people and goods from place to place. What moves the train is the engine. Two distinct things. And just the same he thinks with business, that the purpose of business is to provide goods and services. Now I mentioned the original intent of corporations was to do some sort of social good, right? It's to provide. So if we go back to the earliest corporations were formed to do things like create toll roads or bridges. So when we said, look, it would be good if people could move goods from town to town, the town might not have the resources to build, but if we allow a certain number of people to incorporate and to make a profit, then the motive, the profit motive, might get them to invest in this toll road or bridge, toll bridge or whatever. But the purpose of allowing them to incorporate is because we think bridges are good things, because we think it's good that we can get across a river without having to take a ferry boat or to swim across or to canoe across. So there's a difference between the purpose and the motive of things like that, those sorts of things. And so the argument for the goods and services, what for? Right? So why does Duska think this? He says business itself is a social convention. So we don't often think of business as this sort of social construct, right? We create the rules of business. There's nothing inherently natural about businesses. There might be something natural. There might be something that is inevitable about human beings exchanging things with each other. But the idea that we socially sort of accept a certain type of business arrangement is something that we've manufactured. So it's designed by humans, and we set the rules and expectations. Now, I want to go back for just a second to look at goods and services again in terms of what do I mean by good. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, look, not every business provides a social good like a road. So if we look at our highway system or we look at bridges, say, yes, those are goods, but that's not what most businesses are. They aren't essential in that way, and that's true. But I think what we might look at, or another way to look at it, is to say that we enjoy certain products. So society says the fact that you like your iPhone or your Samsung phone, we think that these things are helpful. Sometimes they're a distraction, but a lot of times I think that they provide us a valuable service, that they help us do work, that they help us communicate with each other, that they entertain us. So those things may not be fundamental. It's like if cell phones were gone, would our lives suddenly somehow turn belly up, that we couldn't live without our cell phones? Probably not, if we're completely honest about it. But it does turn out that these are good things. So society looks and says, yes, those kind of tools are good. Those kind of gadgets are good. And we can look at a number of things, having furniture and having paper. It's nice that I can actually sit down at my desk and write something on a pad of paper without having to go and actually make my own paper, is to take wood pulp and go through the process of making paper and then finding something to write with and creating my own ink. And no, all of those things, having companies that make pens, that make paper and so forth, that's all good. So when we look at these things as social institutions, that in fact businesses are social institutions, notice every business has to be chartered. It has to be incorporated, which means that at some point society says, yes, this business is providing some sort of good or service that we think it's okay to exist in society. So social institutions are created for the good of the group or society. We wouldn't, or we at least shouldn't, allow businesses things that would actually be bad for us, right? We don't want to give special privileges. And notice, again, we do give special privileges to corporations, right? You can't sue the individuals, so the people who incorporate, who run the corporations, are protected from having their personal assets seized if they do something wrong, or quote unquote, the corporation does something wrong. And so we are actually giving them special privileges as a corporation. They're protected by law in various ways. So for Duska, when we think of it in those terms, we think, no, societies actually incorporate corporations. They're the ones that provide the protections. That means that businesses do, in fact, have a certain responsibility, or there are criteria that we could apply to them. So profits may be the means for accomplishing the purpose, but they aren't in and of themselves the purpose. So if business is a convention, we say, yes, we understand that human beings require motivation. We think that the profit motive might actually be good in some cases. In many cases, when it comes to investment or people going into various businesses that are providing goods and services that we desire. But we have to look at what the goods and services are. If those goods and services are things that are good for us in some way, then we say it's okay. They can go on. And we're fine with a profit motive, again, because the outcome of that motive is the thing that we've been shooting at, right? The purpose of business in general was to provide some sort of social good. So as Duska says, society instituted business and its practices and rules, by which we mean the competitive, profit-motivated, free enterprise system to help itself, society, develop and survive. Hence, business is instituted to be beneficial to society. And I think this is, in some ways, a very radical concept, because we normally make a distinction between the sort of private enterprise and public institutions. All right, so we look and say, well, there's public education. If you're taking this class at Youngstown State, you're part of a public institution. Part of your tuition is funded. Part of the cost of educating you is funded by society, viewed as a public good, thinking that education is a public good. If you went to a public school, that was part of a public good. But then we oftentimes sort of separate, at least mentally, the public, like these institutions, like Youngstown State or a public school, we separate that from the private institutions, private businesses, and somehow we think there's something different about them. But what Duska wants us to do is more closely connect those, that those private institutions aren't truly private. They are actually part of a social order. They are instituted by society to provide benefits to society. And if they fail to do that, if they harm society, then we have in some way the moral right to say that these things shouldn't exist, or that these things should be sanctioned in some way. So it's not as if private enterprise should be immune to regulations or sort of public regulation. And I think many people would agree with that. They just don't think of it as a social institution. So we think, for example, pollution, that companies just can't pollute whenever they want, that they have responsibilities to the environment, say. And so we put regulations, and those regulations, while companies may fight those things, we say, well, wait a minute, the purpose of your business is to provide some social good. And if the activities that you're partaking in are actually harming society, then we as a society have a right to say, no, you've got to stop. And that's what Duska is, that's the argument Duska is making, that we've really sort of twisted this notion of the business as somehow a private institution motivated solely by profit, when in fact it is in some sense a social institution, or at least a socially sanctioned institution. So how does he think things got turned around? In part, Duska looks at the invisible hand. So if you think back to Adam Smith, we know the invisible hand justifies motivation because it leads to utility. So there is no doubt that private enterprise, that businesses have led to immense amounts of utility, right? And when we talk about utility, we just mean pleasure or efficient sort of outcomes, right? Goods are cheaper, they're more widely accessible, our quality of life is generally higher than it's been probably at any time in history. So in part, when you see how well this motivation for profit works when it comes to the production of goods and things that we want, the conveniences that we get, he thinks that this is probably one way in which people started to look at the purpose of business as being profit maximization, because there's so much good came out of just doing that sort of motivation. Later proponents of invisible hand confuse purpose, the objective, with the motive subject, the subjective. So we see this even in our legal system, where more and more the courts have ruled that CEOs and CTOs have an obligation to maximize profit. Well, if their primary responsibility is maximizing profit, that we can see in the course of legal decisions that we've lost some of this purpose notion, the idea that businesses aren't just about profit. So there's the famous Craigslist case, and the Craigslist case was one in which AOL had bought a stake in Craigslist, and it turns out that the founders of Craigslist decided that they didn't want to fully monetize their site, that there were things that they weren't doing to actually maximize their profit. And the courts actually ruled that they had an obligation, in fact, even though it's admirable to have a site that has a minimal amount of distraction and doesn't have a lot of ads and so forth and so on, that no, you actually have an obligation. If you're leaving money on the table, then you are actually doing something wrong. And so it seems that this invisible hand idea has actually permeated itself into even our legal system. And he says the end separate from the motive unrealistically allows for business persons to ignore the purpose. So when we separate the motive from the purpose, when we stop talking about the purpose, it allows business people themselves to start thinking that the motive is what's most important. And so Duska wants to remind us that there are, in fact, these two different aspects of business. There's the purpose aspect of business and the motivation aspect of business. And as business people, we should recognize that part of what we do, or part of what you do, is to provide some sort of good or service. We do see this at times with CEOs. The one example that just happens to come to mind is Tim Cook, who has said things about Apple at various keynotes where he says, our purpose is to provide users with the best experience, or is to sort of push forward the public computing or this sort of mobile computing platform to allow creative people and so forth. And you can just go and watch yourself and see all the sorts of ideas or purposes that he puts out for what they do. But someone like Tim Cook has mentioned that profit isn't the end all of what the company does. And so that sort of idea that it's the good we should be focusing on is probably something that's is extremely important, something that we've lost in focusing solely on motivation. There's also been various studies that have shown that companies that actually focus on the good or service tend to do better overall in business than those who focus just on maximization of profits. So companies that invest in long-term in research and refining their product oftentimes end up being better off anyway. So there's a very practical reason to say, or to look and say, perhaps we should be focusing on our purpose as a business and not just on the profit motive for our business. So what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? As Duska says, if we say that the purpose of business is to provide goods and services while the motive is making a profit, then the responsibility of the manager or agent of the business is not simply to pursue profits, but to pursue them regulated by the demands of the public interest. So if we acknowledge that businesses aren't solely motivated, or the purpose of business isn't profit, then it seems that we are justified in more regulating businesses to do public good. Now, this is not to say we socialize businesses, that we take over businesses, but it's to say that if at times we require businesses to do things that might hit at the bottom line, that might be acceptable. right? There can be a justification given. Environmental considerations are one of the most obvious. We might say things like worker pay, right? So we've already put various limitations on how much a business can or cannot pay its workers. So I'd say a minimum wage is one way in which we say, look, we understand that you're motivated by profit, but it's in the interest that workers be paid a fair wage for the work they do. Worker safety is another thing. Regulations that say how long a worker can work or under what conditions, or safety equipment. These are things that we as the public can demand of the business, because even if it's cheaper for them to have more lax safety standards, that's not a justification for them to do so. The fact that they can make more money by doing that is going against the sort of purpose of business, which is to provide the goods and services. And so that by doing a harm to workers, to the public, business is doing something wrong, and we're justified in sort of intervening. Maximizing profits leads to the legitimation of greed. This is probably most evident when we look at the banking collapse in 2008. So what happens in what the sort of common view was that banks and other financial institutions would not lend money in risky situations. In other words, greed or the profit motive would regulate the actions of business people. And clearly we saw with the banking collapse that wasn't the case. Part of the problem during the banking collapse was that there weren't as many opportunities for investment. Banks were looking for ways to make money, and when they formed mortgage-backed securities, taking all these mortgages from individual homeowners, bundling them up and making them into basically a mutual fund, because of the sort of profits that were coming from these things were taking off and the value of these were rising like a stock. It was like you bundle these mortgages together, these things rise in price, people were making a lot of money, and this profit motive meant that many businesses were giving loans to individuals who should never have been approved for loans. And they were buying houses that they couldn't afford, and all of those mortgages were being bundled together, and a lot of them were just very bad lending practices. But it was greed more than anything else that led to the collapse. And so when we look at this idea that profit maximization is the most important thing, that it's not the purposes of business. And we can even look at mortgages. Why do we want banks to lend money to people? Well, we think home ownership is a good thing. It leads to stability. It helps people accumulate wealth, leads them to have a better life, overall life. So, of course, we want banks to lend money. We want them to make profit on that money. We want to encourage them to lend and to invest. But at the same time, there's a purpose behind that. And it seems that when these things are not regulated, when we don't have sort of a stop, when we don't pull back on that maximization of profit can lead to a sort of legitimization of greed, right? This becomes the norm. Of course, greed is good, right? So if we go back to the sort of Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, if you watch the movie where he says greed is good, people wanting more is a good thing. Well, as we've seen sort of in recent history, that's not necessarily a good thing. Finally, one of the things that we also can conclude is that Duska's artist still leaves open the question of what should or should not be produced. So while Duska says we should look at the difference between motivation for doing business and the purpose of business, it still leaves us the question, well, what things ought to be in the market? What sort of businesses ought we to have? What purposes do businesses have that we think are legitimate? And he really doesn't answer that question. He leaves that part sort of open. So as we go on in the course, we'll look later at some answers to these questions as to what makes or what should or should not be in the market, what should or should not be produced by a society. And there are just some things, and I've alluded to sort of the more sort of obvious ones, but this is sort of still an open question. How do I know which types of businesses don't serve a useful social purpose? And that's something we'll have to look at later.